Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Xojo webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. Our topic this time is the IDE. We're going to do a brief overview of the different parts of the IDE, pretty high level. Feel free to ask questions. And the next webinar, towards the end of the month, we'll go over to some power user tips for the IDE. So what does IDE actually stand for? Well, it means Integrated Development Environment, of course. And the development part might be a bit obvious. You're, making apps, you're developing apps, but the integrated part is just that everything's kind of all there for you. So you can do your user interface design right within Xojo itself. You do all your coding within Xojo. You do your debugging and your building. Everything's right within the Xojo toolset. You don't need anything else. And of course, on top of that, Xojo runs on multiple platforms. So in particular, you can use Xojo itself on Windows, Mac, or Linux. You can jump around between them. The projects are all compatible across platforms. So you can start a project on Mac, open it up on Windows, edit it there. That all works. If you have a team of people working on a Xojo project, they don't all need to be using the same version of Xojo on the same platforms. It can be mixed and matched. It all just works together. And then, of course, the other integrated aspect is that Xojo lets you build multiple project types, again, all from Xojo itself with a single tool. So with Xojo, you can make desktop apps. You can make web apps. You can make iOS apps. You can make console apps. And in particular, the desktop and web and console apps can all run on either Windows, Mac, Linux, or Raspberry Pi. So you get a lot of things that are covered there. And of course, as mentioned and shown at XDC earlier this year, Android support is in development. So we hope to have pretty much everything integrated into Xojo for you, so you can use just one tool to make the type of apps that you need. So just to highlight a couple areas, and then we're just going to open up Xojo and kind of go through some stuff and show you some how it looks, how it works. So the Workspace is the main area where you work in Xojo, and that has three sections to it, essentially. There's a toolbar at the top, of course. On the left-hand side is a Navigator, which is how you see the components of your project, the classes, the windows, web pages, etc. In the center, the largest part of the Workspace is what's called the edit area. So that changes depending on what you're doing. It could have the layout editor. It could have the code editor or other editors that appear there depending on what you're working on. And on the right-hand side, we have what is called the library, where all the controls are for when you're working on your layouts. And the inspector. They kind of share the same space, as you'll see. And the inspector shows you property information for whatever happens to be selected. And there are quite a few editors that are built into Xojo. Of course, there's the layout editor, and that it varies by platform. So there's a separate one for web projects and desktop project and iOS projects. There's a code editor, which has autocomplete built in to make it a little easier for you to type your code. The image set editor doesn't actually let you edit images. It lets you bring your images in and collect them appropriately for the sizes they are. So whether they're 1x resolution or 2x resolution or 3x resolution. You can control all that using that editor. The menu editor for desktop projects lets you create your menus for your applications. The toolbar editor is also for desktop projects, for working on toolbars that appear on the windows. And the report layout editor, also for desktop project, lets you do the design of your reports. And the file type set editor lets you specify the type of files that your app works with for opening and saving and whatnot. So that's just a quick highlight of some of the things. So let's just switch over here to Xojo. So when you start Xojo, you get your project chooser. And you can see the various project types and things that are available here on the left-hand side. Desktop, web, console, iOS are your project types, and then you can open recent projects. If you have a common project you always use as a starting point, you can drop it in the templates folder, and then it will show up here. And then all the example projects, of which there are about 400 at this point, are accessible from here. And when you start a project, you generally, give it a name, something more clever than that. And you can fill this stuff in if you want. Mac builds are going to need the app identifier, but Windows and Linux don't really need it. When you click OK, the workspace opens up. And by default, Xojo drops you in here, puts a few things in the project for you, so you're not starting with a totally blank slate. It gives you the app object here, which is a starting point for your app. It gives you an initial window for you to work with and an initial menu bar. And you can see the main areas here: toolbar at the top, Navigator on the left, editing area here, which is shown the layout editor, and here the library is displayed. If I wanted to see the inspector, I can just swap it out with the button here for the inspector. And you can see it's right now showing all the properties of the window, which is what is currently selected here in the edit area. I wanted to design my layout, I can just drag controls, nice drag and drop right from the library onto the layout. And I can switch back to the inspector. And as I click on things, you can see the specific properties for whatever happened to be selected. The navigator here on the left, you can see, shows you each of the items. So I can close the window so you don't see what's in it. And you can see the three main items. I can add more items here. I could add another window if I wanted. I can add classes. And all that shows up here in the navigator on the left. And you can do some organization if you want. So if you want to, group your windows together here at the top, you can do that. If you wanted to make a folder, which is something I sometimes do, you can create a folder, say user interface stuff, and then you could drag your user interface stuff in here if you wanted. Maybe keep that a little cleaner if your project's starting to get large. And then when you expand the folder, you can see the items that are in there. And what's available for you to add varies by the project type. This is what's available for a desktop project, but other projects will have maybe something different or something missing. So, for example, an iOS project wouldn't have a menu bar. But many of these are common, the module and the class, for example, container controls. Also in the navigator at the bottom is the build settings. And for a desktop project, you can build your app for Mac, Windows, or Linux. And of course, Raspberry Pi, which is a subsetting here in the Linux area. So if you do want to give Raspberry Pi a try, you can click on Linux, as Raspberry Pis are essentially running Linux on it, but they run it using a different architecture, as it's called. So by default, standard Linux that you'd use on a regular desktop computer is going to be using x86, but Raspberry Pi uses ARM. So you select this as your architecture, and then when you build your project or remote debug it, it will run on a Raspberry Pi. The similar settings are available for the other project types. So on the Mac side, you've got your name, file types that your app might work with. You can also change the project architecture. By default, everything is set to 64-bit in anticipation of Apple switching, I'm not going to say switching, but dropping 32-bit support from a future version of macOS. They recently announced at WWDC 2018 that the next release of macOS is going to be the last one that supports 32-bit apps. After that, all apps, macOS will only be able to run 64-bit apps after that. So that won't be for over a year from now, but it's good to start planning ahead and making sure that any apps you are building for your customers or for yourself are 64-bit so that they will run on future versions of macOS. And then the bundle identifier is also required for Mac apps. And this generally, you would use your company's domain name and then ending with probably the name of the project is pretty common. Windows has a few similar settings here. The name, of course, a few other things you can fill out that'll show up in info and property windows in the Explorer. And you do have the option to turn on MDI, I never recommend anyone do that, so just pretend I didn't even mention that was there. And then Windows also has the option to build 64-bit and 32-bit apps. Unlike Mac OS, Windows is commonly used in both of these forms. There are still lots of installations of 32-bit versions of Windows. Microsoft still sells that. And there's also 64-bit versions of Windows available. So if you are delivering Windows apps, you have a decision to make as to whether you want to build your app as separate binaries for 32-bit and for 64-bit, or if you just want to continue to ship a 32-bit one, which most 64-bit, actually I think all 64-bit versions of Windows can run. The downside is that running a 32-bit app on a 64-bit operating system does require that 64-bit operating system to have to load additional subsystems using a little bit more RAM, maybe slowing things down a little. So it's always better to try and have the native app. So a 64-bit app on a 64-bit system always performs a little bit better. All right, so going back to you can see the window editor here. That was window 2. Let's go to window 1, which actually we put a couple things on here. You can see this has its own toolbar as well. And each of the editors that appear in the edit area are going to have their own, technically we call this the command bar, which has, little shortcuts for things that are applicable to what you're working on. So the plus item here has a drop down of things you can add to the window, which are, methods, properties, and other less common things such as structures or shared methods or whatnot. But that can all be added here. Many of them have shortcuts, and you can always, of course, add your own. One thing I like to point out is the note capability here just gives you essentially a blank text editor where you can type whatever you want. This isn't for code or anything, so it's a great way to put some thoughts or, an idea of what you're trying to build. Just general notes. And again, it's nice and integrated into the project, so you don't necessarily need to use a separate app for that. It stays right in there. It can remind you of things. You can use it as a to-do list and just have a bullet list of, features or bugs you're working on, whatever works. These two buttons here let you swap between the layout editor and whatever was the last bit of code you were working on. And then if something is selected, you can just press return on it. Oops, I can see my keyboard. And it'll pop up a little pop-up dialog here with a way to let you edit the default property, which in this case is the caption for a push button. And that's also accessible with the little pencil icon up there. You can use the lock button to lock controls to a certain position so that you don't accidentally drag them around and move them when you're editing other things. I don't personally use that too much. Probably should. It is annoying when you spend a lot of time getting your layout just right and then you accidentally bump something and mess it up and then maybe not notice right away. You can control the tab order of your controls and using these two things here, one where you manually adjust things and one where you just kind of pick a default standard of up and down or left to right and let the system figure it out. Not many people use this, but this is the measurements feature of the layout, which shows you some numbers when you're adding things on here, so you can help make sure things position the way you want. You can move around and see how far things are from each other. Again, handy when you're doing very precise layouts and you want everything to look great. And then here you got your usual ordering controls for moving things forward and backward, and stretching and filling things. I don't use those too much. And then alignment controls are all over here. So pretty standard layout type things fill out the rest of the command bar. So you can see there's a lot of stuff there. A lot of people might ignore some of the things up here. So certainly play around with that and see what's might help you work on your layouts a little better. All right, let's look here at the menu bar editor while we're in here. And you can see this kind of shows you what a menu bar is going to look like, gives you some of the options when you click on them. And you can use the preview button here to get a feel for what it might look like on other platforms. It always defaults to the one you're working with. And you can add, new top level ones if you wanted. So I added one there. I can call it view. I could add additional items here. And you can reposition things just by dragging them around if you wanted. And then when you're editing any particular item, of course, it's properties show in the inspector, and you have, a variety of properties here. You can set shortcut keys and what the modifiers are and whatever. So you could set that to be Shift Command A to do this show all feature, and just set that up right there. And then when you use your menu bar on the window, you'll see it specified here. So if you go to the window, there's a property for the menu bar. And that's the menu bar that will be used with the window. You do have the ability to use separate menu bars for Windows. It's these days not generally considered a great design because users tend to find that kind of confusing when the menus drastically change like that. But there can be situations where it makes some sense. So that is an option. All right. Going back to something here. When you want to add code to your projects, you can do it a variety of ways. Here I double clicked on that push button and it popped up the add event window where I can choose one of the available event handlers. Actually, I can choose one or more if I want to multi-select by holding down the command key. A little useful tip there. And I can click OK and they all get added. And then here, when I click on one, I'm now in the code editor. And I can type things. And you'll notice as I'm typing, the ellipses kind of appears there. If I press the tab when that appears, I get a drop down of available things that might be what you were thinking of typing. So you can either just use the arrows to choose it, or if you type enough that it can figure it out, you can see it fills in the G there, and I can just press tab to get that all filled out and press enter to get to the next line. The very handy when you have your own, it also picks up your own variable names and method names and class names and stuff like that. So it's very handy. Obviously you're going to want to give your stuff good descriptions, not I and S like I'm doing here. So when stuff gets longer, this is a great shortcut. Prevents you from having to type out everything. It'll just figure out what you're typing and prompt you to say, hey, you probably mean this. You can just press tab and continue on your way without having to type the whole thing out. All right, I'm going to open up another project that shows the image set editor. So it's actually a toolbar project that I have here. And this shows a toolbar, so it can show that while we're looking at the image set editor. So here you can see a toolbar that's been added to the project. You just add them by clicking on the insert menu, and then toolbar is right there. And you can see it has the toolbar here on the top, and you just use this button to add additional buttons to it. When you add a button to it, you can specify an image, you can give it a caption, and you can set the type of button it is. And there's a few different types you have to work with. And here the icons that you can choose from are graphics icons that I've added to the project, and they're here in the graphics folder. And these are images. So when I click on them, it shows the image set editor. And all this editor is it gives you 3 slots for your images. So the first slot is the image at what's called 1x size. So that's standard size, 1 pixel equals 1 pixel on the screen. And then the second slot is for 2x images, which are images that are essentially double size for high resolution displays, retina displays, that sort of thing. And typically you can just use the 1x and the 2x. The system will scale, choose the one appropriately, and work with that. On some situations, you might want a 3x. I've seen that on some Windows systems, maybe where the user's running an untypical display percentage, maybe 300% or 250 or something like that. So a 3x size might help make the graphics a little sharper, but even then, not always needed. So here the images have all been created, and these were just dragged in from the Finder or Explorer into the appropriate spots. And then the name here is what is used in your project. So back on the toolbar, that's what shows up here as an icon that you're available to choose from. And then to use a toolbar on the window after you've created it, you would just drag it from the Navigator onto the window, and then it would appear down here at the bottom in what's called the shelf. And you can't do anything here with it. You can't edit it or anything like that. The only thing you can do is select it and add event handlers to it. So you can see here the action event handler has been added, which is called when something on there is actually clicked, and it passes in a parameter telling you what was clicked. So that's how that would work. All right, I'm gonna open up another one here to show you the report layout editor. Reports on desktop projects are added again with the, actually I think I need to have it here, add report from the insert menu. And the layout editor for report is a banded report layout editor. So you get your bands here. You get a band for the header, band for groups if you add them, a band for the body, and then you can drag and drop report specific controls onto there to position things. So that's a field, and you can specify, you know, output formats and the text that would show up and that sort of thing. So a pretty standard for a layout editor. And if you've used any report editor in the past, it works very similar. And then the last editor here I want to show before we take a look at a web and an iOS project is file type set editor. And file type set is added again by choosing file type set there. And this lets you specify the types of files that your app can use. In this case, this is showing an app that, or a file that this app can create. And it's, you know, a made-up Xojo text extension, but this app owns that extension. And you just have to fill in the information appropriately. That's described in the user guide. But once you do that, you can use this Xojo text file type so that open dialogues and save dialogues only work with those type of files. Obviously handy with apps that work with multiple files. And you can have, of course, multiple types of files here. So I could add another file type. Say I wanted to have the ability to support PDFs in addition to its own file type. I could just add that. I can have a bunch of them that are listed here. All right, let's take a look at, that was a desktop project. Let's switch back here and web project. Now, one of the beauties of Xojo is that everything is pretty similar across these project types. So you can see here, looking at a web project, at first glance, it doesn't really look all that different from a desktop project. There's no menu bar in the Navigator because that's not really applicable, but it has a main layout, in this case, a web page rather than a window. And it has an additional thing here called a session, which is indicates when someone is connected to your web app. So it gives you a way to store information that is specific to that connection. So that user that is connected, I have to talk loudly over the loud crackling thunder that gives me background ambiance. And then other than that, everything works the same as far as how you design your layouts. You just drag things over. You can add events just like before, or methods, or whatever you want. You can add additional things to the project, organize it however you want, use image sets. Web projects also have styles and dialogues available to them. A dialogue is, like you would think, it pops up information to prompt the user for something, and a style gives you a way to control how controls and things look, change colors and fonts and and things like that. And actually, I can show that style editor here because that has a unique look to it. So if I wanted to maybe have a font that is twice the normal size, I can set it to be 200%. And then I could use that style here, and you would see the font size would be increased. Code editor works the same in web projects. The build settings are also largely the same. The big difference in web projects is you have the ability to create web apps as what's called CGI or standalone. CGI interfaces with an existing web server, typically Apache. And then standalone builds your web app as a standalone app executable that you would run on your web server. And that standalone app will have its own web server built into it. And you would often use standalone if you wanted to run your Xojo web apps, say, behind a load balancer. The load balancer would be the front end to your website, and then it could start up instances of your standalone web apps as needed based on the load. I'm going to skip over console. There's not really a layout in there, not any other editors to speak of. Console is just essentially a text-based app that you would run from a command line. So useful for utilities or maybe something you want to run as a system service. iOS is the last project type I want to show you here. And again, you can see very similar to the other ones. It opens up with the main view showing you where you can edit your layouts. So in this case, in iOS, it is called a view. There's still an app. All of them have an app. iOS has a few extra things as well. It has the screens for iPhone and iPad that allow you to specify if you are actually doing an iPad-specific layout, and the orientations that are supported on the phones and the iPads for when the phone is turned. But you don't actually do any layouts from here. This just kind of lets you specify those settings, shows you what it looks like, but you don't do the layout there. You do the layout on the view. In addition, built in is the requirements for your icons for the app that Apple requires here. So you got to provide a lot of different icons in order for your app to be accepted to the App Store. So you probably will need a graphics tool to create all these, though we do include a little tool in the extras folder of Xojo that if you drag the graphics on there, will at least create a folder with a bunch of these for you, so you can start with those. And then launch screens are optional for apps that have you can kind of think of it like a splash screen. You can do some basic layouts and color changes here. And on the view, you have the same access to the library where you can drag controls and position them around. iOS uses auto layout as a way to align things, which is a bit more powerful. So you can make controls positions related to other controls as opposed to just the main view layout itself. But otherwise, things are working the same along with all the other platforms. Things are event-based, so you can add your event handlers, work in the code editor, all that good stuff that you become familiar with as you're using Xojo to make all your many, many types of apps. And the only other thing here to note in the build settings for an iOS project is the team options that are available to you. So if you've downloaded all your certificates and distribution profiles onto your computer, you do have to use Xcode to do that. Unfortunately, Apple doesn't provide another way. Once you do that, your teams will show up here. So you can pick your company name or your personal name or whatever you have for an Apple Dev account here. And then you'd be able to flip on the build for App Store switch, and you'd be able to build an iOS app that you can then, using App Connect, send up to the App Store. All right, so like I said, there's a pretty high level of the Xojo IDE for the various project types. hopefully it's good to get you to see some of that in action, see what options are available to you. So you can always grab the latest version of Xojo from xojo.com/download. And we release Xojo several times a year, so it's always good to stay on top of that. And if you're just starting out with programming, or even with Xojo, you can grab our free book, Introduction to Programming, from xojo.com/learn. And I always like to suggest to people that they check out the Xojo forum at forum.xojo.com, a great place to ask questions. There's a Getting Started channel in there where you can ask your beginner questions. People are very friendly and helpful there. And of course, the Xojo Dev Center is a holding place for all documentation related things. So developer.xojo.com. There you'll find quick starts, tutorials, user guides, videos, and reference guide, and everything that'll help you learn Xojo quickly. So if you have questions about Xojo, you can always reach me. I'm at email, paul@xojo.com. And I'm on Twitter. I do like Twitter. I find it fun most of the time. So you can reach me at Lefevre. And of course, the Xojo Twitter account is just at Xojo. So I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.